going to be doing a little bit of work on the Camry today. Haven't been driving this thing very much in the last few months because of various nagging problems, but biggest area of concern is the driver's side wheel bearing, and that's in the rear. So we have a little bit of play here. Kind of tough to see on camera, but it's there. Numerous problems with brake calipers, sticking, parking brakes sticking, everything sticking. It's caused a lot of heat in that hub. Finally cooked the old wheel bearing, so I'm going to be changing that out today with a new one, which is over here in the bag. This is a centric unit. It's just the hub and the wheel bearing assembly, so we don't have to mess with any sort of bearing press or any of that fun stuff. First thing we need to do is get the car in the air. So I have two jack stands, and I jack it up in the center, and I leave the jack in place, and then another jack stand on the other side, and then I'll be taking the wheel off. So once you get the wheel off, the next thing you want to do is start to disassemble the caliper. This part here clamps over the pads, and then there's a bracket that this section here bolts into. So there's in this case, it's a 12 millimeter bolt here, which will allow you to start to pry the part that clamps over the pads, the part of the caliper that clamps over the pads out. So I've seen on some cars, it depends on the type of caliper. Sometimes this bolt is a different size, but should be able to, you don't torque it that much. Should be able to get it off with just a 3/8 ratchet. The bolt looks like this. It's pretty long. And then that frees up this part. This is going to take a little bit of prying. You're probably going to need a screwdriver to get that off. Well, not in this case. Depends on how rusty this section is here. And this is basically where the piston clamps down on your brake pads, which if you can see them under there, that's the front one, and then that's the one on the inside. And then this will just sort of slide off. Be careful to pry your boot off up top here. So I'm going to need to take the flex hose off first. So up top here, there's a little bolt that connects to the flex hose. And that looks like that's holding the caliper in. That conveniently is also 12 millimeters. And then the flex hose will pull free, and this will pull free. So once you have the whole piston assembly free, I usually just stick it over in the corner here and balance it on one of the control arms. Some people choose to wire it up. I don't know whether that's really necessary because it'll just get in the way if you try to hang it from here up top where the suspension is. Next, I'm going to pry out the pads. Taking a look at pad wear. It doesn't look too bad, but with these wheel bearing, I think I have an extra set of pads and I might end up putting a new set on. This one's going to be more stubborn. I'm going to need a screwdriver for that. So what I'm doing to get this pad off is I'm just sticking a fairly large handle screwdriver. Don't use a nice one. Use an old, lousy one like this. And I'm just sticking it under the ear, the pad. And just nudging it out. Should free it up enough to wiggle it. And just eventually it'll pull out. This pad doesn't look too bad, but I have a spare set, which I think I'm going to use. After the pads are free, next we have to take this bracket off, and those are a couple bolts that you can't see on the back, so stand by. So in behind the hub, you can see it's a little bit tough with the lighting. We have the disc here, and then there's this bracket which clamps, or not clamps, but bolts onto like the hub back here. There are a couple bolts. There's one there, and there's another one here. These are 14 millimeters. And what I'm doing is using a 14 half-inch 14 millimeter socket with a long extension, because that's going to be what is needed to get through all of the suspension stuff. If you can see kind of what's going on here, there's a sway bar link, sway bar, a bunch of junk in the way. That goes all the way into the hub. Then the 14 half-inch ratchet, and I'm going to go ahead and unbolt those. Okay, so the bracket, once you unbolt it, looks like this. It's basically just the pad carrier and caliper carrier. And now, hopefully, you can work on removing your brake rotor. Now, if your car has parking brakes, which mine doesn't anymore, it used to, there's a little plug in here. If you pull that off, there's a little star wheel assembly that you're going to have to retract. You might have to retract the parking brake shoes, but since this car doesn't have that anymore, I'm hoping that this brake caliper, or sorry, brake disc pulls off. And it does. If it doesn't, there are a couple of little holes that you can use and actually run a bolt into, and that'll help. The bolt will go right into the hub down here, and that'll help pry the whole disc out. But this was off less than a year ago, so it's still fine. I ran a little bit of anti-seize around the outside here. Always a good idea to do so it doesn't freeze up, because nobody likes it when these rotors stick onto the hubs. Now, there are 4 bolts that hold the actual hub / axle carrier assembly, whatever you want to call it on. There's one there, one down here, one over here, and then the last one is down there. You can see it. Like I said, this car does not have parking brakes anymore. If it did, these would be a lot harder to see. However, you can still pull the whole assembly without taking the parking brakes out. At least that's what I've seen on the later model, Gen 4, which I think has the same rear hub assembly as the Gen 3 here. So I'm going to get my big ratchet, and I'm going to go ahead and unbolt those 4 bolts. So again, there are holes you can conveniently spin the hub around so you can get in. It's still a 14 millimeter. I use my longer, horrible freight ratchet. 59 foot-pounds on these, so it's a little bit of torque to deal with, so the little half-inch ratchet may not be quite enough. Try a shorter extension. That'll make it a little bit easier. So now after a little bit of messing around, I think this is the best extension combination. It's my 2 short ones. So that way I can put enough torque on these bolts to get them off without snapping anything and not having too long an unwieldy setup off of my ratchet. decided to put a little bit of liquid wrench on the bolts as the base of them get kind of mucked up with junk, and then the socket gets stuck. So hopefully this next one that I'm pulling here won't get stuck. I had to actually run this back into the hub, jiggle the socket around a little bit to get it loose, and then run it back out again. Okay, this last bolt in back there, I'm pulling out. Left bottom bolt. Now the whole hub assembly with some rocking should just slide right out. So in here, there's a little O-ring that you have to sort of pry out and pull out. That's going to be replaced with the new kit. And then this bore in here is very dirty, so I'm going to blast this whole thing with some brake parts cleaner and see if I can get it cleaned out so that I don't get any metal shavings or any fun stuff into the new wheel bearing, which would not be very good. Okay, so after a copious amount of cleaner was used around this cylinder, bore, I don't know what you would call it, this thing in the hub where the bearing bolts into, I'm going to go ahead and fit the new bearing. We're going to put the O-ring on. This comes off the new wheel bearing. Try to keep this clean, but it's going to be tough. If this car were to be used for a longer period of time, I probably would have to replace the whole hub, as it is kind of corroded. But at this point, just going to bolt the new wheel bearing in, and hopefully there isn't too much junk in there which will contaminate it. So the O-ring is now on, and we're going to bolt the new bearing in. Always use anti-seize on your bolts. That way you can get them off again, especially here in the Northeast where the rust is incessant and unceasing. It's not as hard as I thought. All 4 bolts are in. Let's see. Top here is 1, 2, 3, and then down on the bottom, number 4. I'm just going to go ahead and tighten them in a crisscross pattern and then torque them in a counterclockwise or clockwise pattern. Doesn't really say anything in the book about how to do that, but yeah, I got a torque wrench set to 60. Might be a little hard to see, it's a little too close to focus, but just to be on the safe side, torque spec is 59 foot-pounds, but whatever. It's going to be a little bit difficult with the amount of swing that I'm going to need, but we'll make it work here. All right, new wheel bearing installed. put the rotor back on, so what I'm going to want to do is run a little ring of anti-seize around where this lip on the hub here, so that the rotor hopefully doesn't get stuck. Before I fit the rotor, try to do the same thing on the inside of the rotor. The rotor just simply slides on over the lugs. And then you have to mount after that the caliper mounting bracket, or as the manual calls it, the torque plate. We've already seen where these two bolts that hold that in for are, that go on the back of the hub slash axle carrier, whatever you want to call this thing here. 34 foot-pounds for those two bolts. So I'm going to mount this back up. So the torque plate slash caliper bracket, whatever you want to call it, is torqued and installed and torqued in there. Next thing I want to do is just spray the whole disc here, section of the rotor, with some brake parts cleaner because I got it all dirty. Now I'm going to be putting in a spare set of new pads because the other ones look like they were worn kind of unevenly, probably due to that wheel bearing being out and causing the caliper to drag. This is some Axis, formerly Repco. I like to say Axis bolt, it's Repco. It's a joke, but they're pretty low end. But just had a spare set because I had actually replaced these before when I did the caliper last year, but now it looks like I'm gonna have to do them again. Probably won't be the last time, knowing the problems that you have with these brakes, and they just clip in. Some people like to put brake grease on these little ear bits here, but I find that in the Northeast it just picks up junk, and then it can just cause it to stick, which is what you're trying to avoid by putting the grease on those ears, but it just sticks anyway, so I don't usually bother with it. So you just have to clip in. They're a pain. They require a fair amount of persuading, but eventually they get in there, and we'll have to do the same thing on the back side. So once you're ready to actually bolt the caliper in, as I have both pads are now clipped in here, depending on what side of the car you're on, this wear indicator here for the pads can be kind of annoying. It's this thing that sticks up that I'm pointing to. You have to make sure that's going to clear the caliper. I think I should be in good shape with that. You always want to use some brake caliper lube. This is Permatex Ultra Disc Brake Caliper Lube. I don't know, there's a million of them out there. But you want to grease your slide pins to make sure that they are working properly. So just spread some of that around up top on this pin, and then the other one is in the actual caliper itself, so I'll show you that in a second. This is the slide pin here. Looks like it's a bit sticky, so with the boot you can pull back, and if I can pry it enough I may have to use some pliers. Oh, nope. The boots stay captive in this side of the thing, the ear of the caliper, and then the whole pin can slide out with a little bit of prying. You want to make sure you grease this part as well. Looks like there's still some residual grease from when I did it last time, but this is fiddly and definitely test your patience, but that's what you gotta do. So there we go, and then we'll just put some grease on that. stick this up here for now. I'll clean it off and then put some grease on that. Put it back in. Make sure those boots do, you can't really see it, but they have to be notched into the outside of the slide pen, and then it just floats in there under that caliper ear. There's already some grease in there, so it should be fine to continue. For us to continue on, next thing we're gonna have to do is get a big C-clamp and retract this piston. Make sure you inspect the boot and make sure that the boot is actually in the groove for your piston. This looks a little confusing, but I think we're okay. And what I'm going to do is get a big C-clamp and retract the whole piston back. So there are probably numerous special tools that people have used for this. What I just did is get a big C-clamp. There's not going to be too much pressure on it. One end goes on the piston side over here. Other end goes on the other part of the caliper. And I'm just going to spin the C-clamp until the piston is fully retracted. Doesn't usually take too long. I'm gonna watch it go in right now, right at the top of the screen there. And there you go, this caliper's in good shape, so it went right in. Next thing we want to do is see if we can mount it. Now this thing you're gonna have to fiddle with this bottom slide pen in order to get it to line up and eventually get that bolt in. So I usually like to push it all the way towards the inside of the car before I try to mount the caliper. Now I'm going to try to mount the caliper up on the top of that slide pin. You can't see it, but this goes right there, and then it just takes some maneuvering to get that in. And then you have to make sure that the boot up top here, can't see it, this has to be in the groove so the water and junk does not get into this top slide pin here, that caliper, so that's going to take some more fiddling. Clearance, this drops over it, and then you can go ahead and bolt up your caliper bolt down here, the last one that I call it like the hinge bolt that will secure the caliper. We should be in business. Okay, so the caliper bolt that goes back in here for the hinge, the caliper hinge bolt is in, reinstalled up here. My hose, caliper hose attach or securing thing, I don't know what you want to call it, like secures the strut, don't forget that. Last step I want to do, since this is a brand new hub, I'm going to put anti-seize on all of the new studs, and then I'm going to pump the brakes to make sure that the caliper clamps down and then releases freely so that this can still spin. Do a quick test with that. Put the wheel on is 75 foot-pounds for the lug nuts, and you should be all set. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, do YouTubey things, and I'll see you in the next video.